Okie dokie, my little artichokes, it's Miss Lovejoy, and we are going to work on our decodable reader today. The letter for the week is E, and E says eh, eh. Sometimes we get the sound for E and the sound for I mixed up, so I want you to listen to these sounds. E says eh, I says eh. They're a little bit different. Listen again. Eh, eh. When I say eh, my mouth is a little more open, and when I say eh, my mouth is a little more closed. Eh, 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 eh. So we're going to be talking about the letter E today. It says eh. Here's our sight word for the week. This word is R. Can you help me write it in the air? A, R, E spells arf. And then the other sight words we're going to need to know are A and go. So E says eh. This is the word R, A, and go. All right, let's go ahead and get started with our story today. Put your eyes on the first word of our title and help me sound it out. Ed. Ed. This is a name, Ed. And Ed. Ted. Another name, Ted. Ed and Ted can go on. Ed and Ted can go on. So I'm assuming this is Ed and Ted, but we don't know who's Ed and who is Ted yet. But the title of our story is Ed and Ted can go on. Ed, met, Ed, Ted. Ed met Ted. The men go on. The men go on. Good readers are going to go back and read that whole page. Ed met Ted. The men go on. We don't know who Ed and Ted are yet, but I think on the next page we're going to find out who's Ed and who's Ted. So there's our name again. Ed. Ted can tap it. Let's read that sentence. Ted can tap it. Ed can tip a net. Ed can tip a net. Let's read that whole page. Ted can tap it. Ed can tip a net. So now I know that this is Ted because he's tapping, and this is Ed because he is tipping. Ooh, same name. Do you guys remember? Ed, and Ed, Ted, sight word, are, ought. our sight word for the week are Ed and Ted are hot. Ed can sit and sip. Ed can sit and sip. Ed and Ted are hot. Ed can sit and sip. Ed can nap. Ed can nap. Ted can sit and sip. Ted can sit and sip. Ed can nap. Ted can sit and sip. Ted can tap it. Ted can tap it. The men can go on. The men can go on. Ted can tap it. The men can go on. All right, friends, let's go back and reread this whole story. I think we can know their names by now. Every time we see this, it's Ed, and every time we see this, it's Ted. Do you guys think we can do that without sounding out? I think so. Ed and Ted can go on. So the title of this story is Ed and Ted Can Go On. Ed and Ted are the main characters in this story. Ed met Ted. The men go on. Ted can tap it. Ed can tip a net. Ed and Ted are hot. Ed can sit and sip. Ed can nap. Ted can sit and sip. Ted can tap it. The men can go on. Good job, friends. We'll read this story again tomorrow.